Hello and welcome to some extraordinarily good news. When did you last hear of a children's book for a good reason? This one, written by a very faithful Catholic, is exceptional for two reasons. It is brilliantly written and it is steeped in practical Catholic morality. What a shocker. Here is Mrs. Maria Waddelove to tell us all about the story of the boyhood of the legendary English King Alfred. Hello, Mrs. Waddelove, and welcome.
Hello, Frank. Nice to be here.
Oh, well, lovely job. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the book?
I was born in Manchester, in England. I'm the eldest of 10. I went to Catholic schools in Manchester and then a college in Southampton for teacher training, a Catholic college. And then I went back to Manchester to teach for 11 years. I taught in primary schools in Manchester, and then I met my husband and married and moved to Cheshire, where I had 5 children and decided to homeschool them as well. It was during the homeschooling and studying history, I've always been very interested in history, that I realised that King Alfred was a very great man. And that's when I started to think, well, maybe I should write a book about King Alfred as a boy. And that was the beginning of the story of the book. My children are now grown up. I have 6 grandchildren at the moment, and 3 not married yet, but doing very well, all of them. So that's good. Yeah.
Lovely job. So you told us that you came to begin to write this outstanding book whilst you were homeschooling your children. Presumably you homeschooled your children because you are, like myself, a religious extremist. It's a very laudable thing to be. But one question I would like to ask many writers, though perhaps not as charitably as I'm going to ask it to you, is why did you write this book?
Still in the Anglo-Saxon period with the children, and I realised I read a lot about King Alfred as part of that, and I started to do more and more research into King Alfred. And as I was doing it, I realised that he was really a very exceptional man, in that he was not expected to be king because he was the youngest of 5, that he eventually became king, and in awful circumstances, because his kingdom was beset by Vikings who had basically occupied all the other kingdoms of England at that time. And then it became even worse because he had to flee at one point in his life to the Athelney Marshes. And it must have been a terrible time. He'd lost his kingdom. That was the last kingdom to fall to the Vikings. And he managed to defeat them from there and regain his throne and rebuild the kingdom. And he rebuilt it he not only displayed courage in doing that, but he also was a very wise king, in that once he'd regained his kingdom, he had the little towns built, the defended sites that could be the people of the local area could move to when they were under attack from the Vikings. So he defended his people. He rewrote some of the laws, but based them on the Mosaic law, which I thought was extremely wise of him. And he tried to encourage education in the country, which had sadly failed due to many of the Viking raids, actually, because they very often ransacked libraries and burnt all the stuff in them. So education was sadly lacking. So he did those things. But in addition to that, he taught himself Latin. I presume his bishops and priests taught him Latin. He translated 3 pieces of work which, when you read them, are just so profoundly Catholic and very insightful of the king's mind that really impressed me. His desire he wanted to go to heaven. He wanted to be a good king. He wanted to do all the things that were wise and just in his kingdom, leave it with a good name, but also attain eternal life. And it's very evident in the things that he wrote. That's what he was seeking. And I was just deeply impressed by him. So I thought, well, what if I make him into what if I look at that man and imagine him as a little boy and set him in an adventure? And so I tried to take all the virtues I'd seen in the king and put it in the little boy, but only in a boy form. and write a story about him. That's how it started.
Wonderful. So you've drawn from your historical knowledge of the real King Alfred, who really was inspired by God to lead to the unity of England, and you've managed to animate the story of his early life as a boy in a way that has captivated the imagination, certainly of my own son. He's been reading your book and he finds it absorbing. He's a harsh critic of my own writing, but not of yours. Did you always find it easy to capture the imagination of children in that way?
Well, I've taught for 11 years. I taught primary school children, and obviously I read lots of books to the children as well. And then I had my own children as well. So I think I've lived in a world of children for a long time. So I think I was familiar with what my interests in, basically. And I knew that young Aelfred, he had to have an adventure. It had to grip. It had to appeal to a child as well. So it had to have a bit of fun about it as well. It couldn't be very, very morose, or a morose book. It had to be a fun-filled, adventurous book, as well as displaying all the virtues of the king as a boy.
Well, it does. This is the thing for me, is that it is adventurous, it is thrilling, but it's not just thrilling for what happens outside of Alfred. It's also thrilling and engaging for what happens within him. I mean, in reading the book, there's many cases in Alfred's boyhood where he's challenged by personal and interior moral struggles, but you use Alfred's inner life to show how he resolves these. And it's with a very light touch that indicates your profound infusion of practical Catholic morality. I mean, did you find that easy?
Actually, I did, yeah. I put him in various situations, and I thought, well, how would a little Catholic boy respond in those situations, and acted accordingly. So I tried to make him behave as I thought King Alfred would have behaved. I always wanted him to do the right thing, but also in a kind of exciting way as well. So I found that fairly easy. But I have to say that when I started writing Alfred, I wrote it really badly. Really, really badly. And I put that aside, and then I wrote it again, but probably about the first third again. And that wasn't very good either. And then at some point I thought, why don't you write this book? Why don't you make this book read like a book you have read? And I read a lot of books. And that's when I began to write it. I think I found my voice, what they call the author's voice, and that made it much easier to write from that point onwards. And
well, it's a splendid voice.
Well, thank you. Some of the storyline came along as I was writing it as well. In fact, in the end, it began to write itself almost, because I had the plot. And once you get going, and then I'd add bits depending on. I tried to fashion it so that what happened in the early stages would be reflected later on in the story, so that it had a finished look to it, I suppose.
So how long would you say it took you to write the book? How long did it take you to write the book?
It took me 17 years.
17 years.
Yeah. I did a lot of research to start with, and then I wrote it. I was homeschooling, so obviously the weeks were, taken up with work, teaching the children. I used to creep down on a Saturday morning and sit myself down by the computer, and I'd immerse myself in Anglo-Saxon England and the King Alfred story. And I really, really enjoyed writing it, actually. I mean, sometimes you look at the screen and it's a blank screen and you think, oh dear, what next? But once you get going, it was quite, quite exhilarating, actually, especially towards the end, because I know it does get quite, I put him in an awful, tricky position at the end.
Mighty nations stumble, world war threatens. There's destruction on the battlefield and also in the womb. And all this is happening because man has forgotten God. Pope Pius XI said, man must look for the peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ. And he urged that the faithful give public honor to Christ the King so that individuals and states would submit once more to the rule of their Savior. And that is why LifeSite News is raising up the image of Christ the King across the United States. Our billboards have already proclaimed the rule of our divine Savior to tens of thousands of Americans, and you can help us reach millions more. Only when Christ the King reigns over our hearts and our minds will there be peace among nations and peace in our homes. Please pledge your support today for these billboards at lifefunder.com/ChristIsKing.
It's
Yeah.
extraordinary that you didn't give up, and thank God that you didn't. Your book is marvellous. I mean, I've read a lot of histories of England, and in one that comes to mind that I've read recently, been reading recently rather, is Robert Tombs's Liberal History of the English. He typifies the right-thinking chauvinism of the modernist. To find a book about the past that doesn't despise our Catholic heritage and its heroes is rare. Was it hard then to find a publisher for your book?
Actually, I didn't think I would, because you're right, it's a very Catholic book. I deliberately made it a Catholic book in that I tried to show the world that Alfred came from was very ordered, and there were problems in the court, in the Wessex court, but it was an ordered society, and tried to contrast that with the heathen camp, and it was deliberate. So I was trying to show that the Catholic and also the monastery was very deliberate inclusion, because I wanted to show that a Catholic world could be beautiful to be in. And
Wonderful.
when I finished it, I thought, well, I don't think anyone's going to want to read this because it's a very Catholic book. But I sent it to, it's very difficult to find an agent these days. So I had somebody in the village who had some books published by a company that, it's a publisher, they're a proper publisher, but they don't need an agent. So I sent it to them, and I was astonished when it came back. And they said they'd really enjoyed it. They didn't know how they'd market it necessarily, because I think it's a little bit different, but they loved it.
Well, it's good for a start, and that's exceptional in today's literary quagmire. I think
Yes.
talent is actually an impediment to getting published these days, but there it is.
Yes, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
moral tales these days, the trouble is moral tales these days are usually anything but, and intentional sermons on matters of morality can be improving, but hard to endure. I mean, your story manages to be both fascinating and instructive. It's almost a manual on how to live according to the principles of the Catholic Church. I mean, did you intentionally write it like that?
No, I think perhaps in one way I did, in that I admired King Alfred. He lived his life, and it was a very Catholic life, and a very good one. And therefore it seemed to me that he was worth writing about. And perhaps, actually, in writing about him, I was able to show that he was able to live a very good Catholic life, and that it was worth living, and that it was an example for others. I didn't set out to make it kind of moral treatise. I just thought I'd wrap it up in a story, I suppose.
Oh, yes. It doesn't read like some boring instruction book about how to assemble a moral washing machine. It's a fascinating and absorbing tale that you managed to pull off this tremendous accomplishment that I think exemplifies Aristotle's injunction towards practical wisdom and virtue. And at the same time, it's fascinating, and the children I've heard of reading it love it. And so do I, being something of a child myself. I suppose that's a recommendation of sorts. But the thing is that your book has obvious literary merit, which again makes it stand out from most of the trash that we're compelled to call literature today. And capturing the inner life of anyone is a near impossible task, and yet we see Alfred develop from the inside of his own mind and heart as he does in the world. And I think this blend of the interior and the exterior is often attempted, but seldom so well achieved in any literature. How did you learn to do that?
I think I got inside the child's head, really, and I think that's how I did it. But I have to say that I remember remaining entirely focused on Alfred the whole time I wrote it. There were 2 chapters that I put in to give the book some idea of what's going on outside of Alfred. But the whole time I wrote the book, I was concentrating on Alfred, what he did, how he felt, how I thought he would feel, given I read quite a bit about the adult. And so I stayed very, very focused, I would admit that. And I think just by a combination of writing basically I wrote an adventure story, and then I wrote about the little boy that was in the adventure story and how he felt about it. I don't know how I managed it, but I'm glad I did.
Well, I don't know how you managed it either. I think it's an extraordinary achievement. Your book is outstanding, and to having raised 5 children in the faith and homeschooled them yourself, and to keep this up over 17 years is simply a terrific achievement. I think you should be rightfully proud of yourself. I mean, you've done us all a service in producing such a wonderful book. Finally, given the wondrous enrichment to the world, which I think your book represents, can we expect another? I've found myself reluctant to finish it because I'm fearful there won't be another one just like it. And I'm sure anyone who reads your book will feel the same. Can we expect a follow-up?
I would love to write another book. I've already tentatively started one on King Oswald as a boy, of Oswald of Northumbria. But I'm still trying to. We know an awful lot about King Aelfred, but not as much about King Oswald, and so I'm trying to find as much as I can in order to turn him into a boy and put him in an adventure, because it's going to be slightly more difficult because King Oswald is when I write the story, he will not be a Christian, but he will meet Christians, and they will have a profound influence upon him, make him the King Oswald who actually converted on Iona, I think it was, and brought Aidan to Northumbria. And so I'm trying to work on that idea, which is a little bit more difficult than Aelfred, just because we know less about him. But that's where I'm going at the moment. So I would
what a tremendous relief. I would encourage readers, listeners, viewers, not only to buy your excellent book, but also to harass you into completing another one, because your book is a treasure, and it's not just an engaging account for young people to read about King Aelfred, but it's such a wonderfully instructional piece of England's Catholic heritage and history. Something that's so often overlooked nowadays, as we've been eclipsed by this liberal global nightmare, which I think happily is dissolving. So thank you very much for having brought this into the world.
Okay.
And I wish you every success, and God bless your efforts to complete another one. Let's hope it doesn't take another 17 years.
I hope not. I don't think it will, but yeah, thank you very much for all those kind words. And I'm glad that you've enjoyed it, and your son, and I hope lots of people will, like you, will enjoy the book.
I'm sure they will. Thank you for talking to us today.
Okay, right. Okay, thank you, Frank.
Thank you again.